Hi everyone, it's Tarrant.
And Stella here from Meeple University. Thanks for joining us.
Today we'll be teaching you how to play Circadians Chaos Order. After watching this video, you'll be ready to play the game. Stay tuned. Let's learn to play Circadians Chaos Order, game designed by S.J. McDonald and Zachary Smith and published by Garphill Games.
If our video has been helpful to you, then please help us making more of these videos by liking the video, comments below, and subscribe. For now, let's get to the table.
Circadians Chaos Order is an asymmetrical tactical wargame for 2 to 5 players with a Euro-style engine, set among the different factions within the Circadians universe. Players will compete amongst each other to set the prices and turn orders on the game's different actions. Then we'll research the tracks, construct buildings, harvest resources, recruit new fighters, and then head out in search of conquest. There are 2 paths to victory. Players can try to gain control of all of the ancient relics that are lying on the board, and can win the game by holding all relics at the end of a round. Or they can win by maximising fame. Each faction has its own separate fame track and its own separate way of gaining fame points. And if you can max out your track before the others, or before a win on relics, then you'll win the game. I won't take you through setup step by step. What I've done here is set up for a 3-player game, and I'll introduce you to some of the components. And do note, this is a moderately asymmetrical game. All of the rules that I'll take you through apply to most of the factions. And then at the end of the video, I'll take you through each individual faction and their different rules. On the right-hand side of the board is the map, made up of pre-printed and placed hex tiles. There are 3 types of land terrains: plains, swamps, and cliffs, and you'll add some more of these to the board depending on your player count. There are lakes, which are inaccessible, and each player will have a base hex, which is placed on one of these spaces around the edge of the board for a base depending on your player count. Empty spaces like this, which are above your player count, treat as if they're not present. You will place some mountain tiles like this, which block off the adjacency between 2 hexes. Each faction begins the game in control of the 2 land hexes adjacent to its base, and this is where one of your leaders, shown by these illustrated standees, and all of your fighters, these meeples, will begin. Every land hex is seeded with a square foundation tile, which is where a building can later be constructed. The neutral land spaces are also seeded with the game's 6 numbered relics. Each relic is placed over the top of the foundation, which depicts its number and blocks that foundation from use. However, for the ease of the overhead shots in this video, we're going to show the relics lying down next to the foundations. These serve as a key focal point for area control, and they also count the rounds. The relic corresponding to the round number will be removed from the board, whether controlled or not, at the end of each round. And that will make its foundation available. The game plays to a maximum of 6 rounds. Around the edge of the map are the score tracks, and each faction has its own. At the bottom of the board are the tactics cards, which players will collect and then use either in combat or for actions. And on the left of the board are the 5 research tracks, at which each player starts on the far left. These tracks will indicate how strong each of a player's actions in these 5 areas will be through the game. Each faction's player area will be set up something like this, and you'll follow your faction's help guide for any specific setup instructions. Among the components, you'll have your foundations, which are placed grey side up on the space corresponding to the same icon. Rows of unconstructed buildings, including the flat foundry pieces, these medium-sized outposts, and these largest pieces, the strongholds. Fighters who aren't on the board will be down at the bottom of your player board, ready to be deployed. And you'll have your leaders, each of which corresponds to a standee, and attributes, which are a range of positive or negative effects associated with your faction. These cards are all placed on their unupgraded side, which will be in player colour, rather than the yellow upgraded side. Players begin with 6 energy and 1 gem, although may need to spend some during their choices of setup. Energy is the game's base currency, and gems are a more valuable resource which you'll have to spend on some of the more powerful actions. Finally, each player will begin with 4 pricing markers, in addition to the 2 which begin in the vault or discard pile. You're now ready to play. Chaos Order is played in a maximum of 6 rounds, and each round is played in 9 phases, which are laid out from top to bottom of the main board. Each phase has its own icon, and where you see that icon elsewhere in the game, it refers to an effect in that phase. First is set prices, and here each player will use these pricing tokens to set the price and turn order for one of the next 5 phases. Second is discover, where players can pay resources to move up on one or more of the research tracks, increasing the power of their actions. Third is build, where players can build either foundations or buildings onto areas they control on the main board. Fourth is harvest, where players can gain energy and gems, as well as what's shown on the production spaces of areas they can tap. Fifth is recruit, allowing players to bring more fighters and leaders into play. And sixth is move, letting players move their leaders and units around the board and pay energy to upgrade their leaders. Seventh is combat. One at a time in any hexes containing 2 or more factions, players will resolve combats, resolving them with a combat wheel mechanic until each hex has been reduced to only a single faction. Eighth is gain income, where players will gain a benefit based on how many hexes they control and any icons they've uncovered along their income bar. Finally, you'll check relics, and this feeds into the game's win conditions. If at the end of the round a single player controls every hex that still contains a relic on the board, then that player wins the game immediately. Here, for example, blue controls all 6 relics after round 1. This would be highly unlikely, but if it were to happen, blue would win right now. If this is not the case, then whoever controls the current round's relic takes it and adds it to the leftmost available space of this track, gaining the benefit covered. If no player controls this round's relic, it's just removed from the board. Since one relic is removed from the board each round, it becomes much easier to win the game on the check relics criterion as the game goes on. And if the game does reach round 6, then the entire victory hinges on this one hex's control. But there is a second asymmetrical way to win, and this is to maximize your faction's fame, reaching the end of your specific fame track. There are 2 ways to gain fame: by collecting relics, covering up fame icons on your track, or by completing your faction's asymmetrical fame condition. Oxataya gains fame by winning battles. Jrayek gains fame by winning battles where leaders are present. AI gains fame by wounding opposing fighters in battle. Zcharo gains fame by moving up on research tracks. Circadians gain fame by upgrading attribute cards. And Leyrien gains fame as income by placing these special morale tokens onto the board. Each faction gains separate immediate benefits as they move up on their fame tracks and has a different threshold for victory. So now that we understand the round sequence and victory conditions, let's have a look at each step of a round in detail. The first phase is set prices. This takes place in turn order, starting from the player with the flare gun and going clockwise. Each player has 6 pricing tokens in player colour, which can either be in hand or in a discard pile called the vault. On your turn, take a pricing token from your hand and put it into the pricing slot of a phase which is yet to be priced. If there's an immediate action at the top of the tile you placed, resolve it right away. This would allow the player to pick up the tiles from the vault and draw a tactics card. If there's a bonus resource on the space which is placed, then gain that immediately. By placing a pricing token, you are setting 2 things: the price for all other players to take this action and the turn order for this action. When the time comes to resolve the build action, Grey will play first and will get to take this action for free. Play will then proceed clockwise, and any other player who wishes to take the action will have to pay 2 energy to the Grey player and 2 energy to the supply, indicated by the orange box. A player who can't afford it or doesn't wish to pay can pass the build phase. Pricing the move phase works a little differently because you can choose to price in the first slot, meaning you'll gain a bonus tactics card, but you'll go first in turn order. Or you can price last, meaning you won't get a bonus, but you get to move last after you've seen where all other players have moved. Either way, the flare gun is now moved to the next player in turn order after the player who priced the move action. If that player already had it, then it's handed an extra space clockwise. Each player places 1 token in the set prices phase unless you're playing at 2 players, in which each player will place 2. Unless you're playing with 5 players, there'll still be 1 or 2 phases left unpriced. To deal with this, you'll use the neutral pricing tokens, and each of these starts the game as a stack of 2 tokens, with the player count shown on the opposite side. This one, for example, is used at 2 to 4 players. The top tile from the stack is shared at the end of the rounds shown, so this after round 4 would go from a 3 energy cost to a 5 energy cost. This one is a cost paid to the supply. This one is a cost paid to each of your neighbours and adds a cost to the supply as the game goes on. The neutral stacks fill these empty slots, and in the 3-player game you'll go from lowest total cost to highest total cost, running top to bottom. If the neutral prices move, then put it on the first slot and hand the flare gun 1 step clockwise from its current position. For any phases priced by the neutral, whoever has the flare gun goes first. Next, you'll resolve the 5 priced phases in sequence, and each of these is resolved in a very similar way. You will pay the energy cost, resolve the effect on the top row where your research cube currently sits, and then optionally pay the resources shown to resolve the effect in the bottom of your column. Ignore the effect in the middle for now. For any action you don't wish to take, you can pass. The Discover action is all about moving up on research tracks. Each of these icons represents 1 step of research you can do. Here you could do 1 step of research or pay 2 gems to do 2. A research point lets you move 1 step to the right on any one of the 5 tracks, and then you'll gain the benefits shown in the middle space as an immediate reward. If you wish to cross a line containing this icon, then you must additionally pay 1 gem to do so. This is called a gem lock and represents an additional gem cost for a variety of actions in the game. The next phase is build, and when you take the action, each one of these icons you gain is 1 build point, each of which lets you build any one of your foundation tiles or the leftmost building in any one of your 3 building types. If there's a gem lock on the tile or under the building, then it additionally costs a gem, but otherwise it just costs the build point. When you research the build track, this icon gives you a build point which may be used only on a foundation. When you build a foundation, place it foundation side up in any land hex you control, that is, where you have fighters, leaders, or buildings. This does not include your base. Do note that at this point nobody's moved since the last round of combat, so there's never a conflict over who controls an area. There can be a maximum of 3 foundations per hex. All foundations once placed look the same. Essentially, they no longer belong to the player who put them down once they've been placed. When you construct a building, it's placed on an empty foundation tile in a hex you control. There may be a maximum of 1 of each type of building per hex, and if you place a building so that it covers a bonus on a foundation, then you gain that bonus. Each building you place unlocks some income and has a benefit on the board. Stronghold effects tend to be unique to the players, but outposts will help you with extra strength in combat and allow you to move more quickly around the board. And foundries allow you to gain resources in the next action, harvest. The next phase is harvest, which is a way of gaining resources. First, gain the energy shown at the top, and then harvest from gears. Each gear icon lets you gain the resources showing in the gear, either on your base tile or on a tile you control containing one of your foundries. If you get multiple gear icons, each must be used on a different gear. Then you can spend energy for one or more gems. When you research the harvest track, upon reaching this space, take one of the 6 stronger production tokens and put it in a region you control covering its existing token. This region can include your base. If you reach the final step of this track, then flip any one such token you control over to its even stronger gold side. The next phase is recruit, and there are 2 elements to recruit: spending recruit points and deploying leaders. Recruit points are spent moving fighters to the board. At the bottom of your player board are all of your available fighters, and you can spend recruit points in order to move them towards your base. Here, for example, 1 recruitment point would move this fighter to my base, from where I would take it off my player board and place it on my base tile of the main board. Here I could spend a recruit point to move a fighter from the wounded box to the ready box, and then a second recruitment point to move it to base. Some factions also have a fast track option. Here I could spend a recruitment point and 1 energy to move a fighter straight to the base from wounded. Each player also has an alternative benefit for spending recruit points. Here, for example, tactics cards. The bottom row effect is to spend energy to deploy a leader. Choose a leader whose standee is not already on the board, pay any additional cost shown in its top left corner if applicable, and then move its standee to your base. The next phase is move, and this allows you to move your units around the map and then upgrade your leaders. First, we'll look at movement, and this icon represents 1 movement point which can be used to move a unit or group of units from one hex to an adjacent one. There are several restrictions. You can't move through a mountain tile, and you can't move onto a hex which is not in the game. You can't move onto a lake. You can move off a base hex, but you cannot move onto one, not even your own. Your base does not have to be defended. You permanently own it because nobody else can ever enter it to try to take it from you. At 4 or 5 players, these tunnels provide adjacency around the board. This hex is adjacent to this one, and this hex to this one. You may freely move into a hex containing other players' units, but at any time, each single unit pins 1 unit from each other faction present, preventing it from leaving. As such, these 2 blue units presently cannot leave, but 2 of these purple units can leave, with only the other 2 pinned by blue. Units from different factions are never added together when resolving pinning. These 4 grey units are enough to pin both the purples and the blues, and 3 of the grey units are pinned by blue, only 1 being able to leave. For the purposes of movement, any outpost you've built on the board is considered adjacent to your base, allowing for more rapid movement of your recently deployed leaders and fighters. However, your outposts are not considered adjacent. Finally, you are allowed to move leaders into hexes containing other leaders, but they cannot finish the move phase there. You must move in such a way that all your leaders are in different hexes when you're done. The lower half of the move action lets you spend an amount of energy to upgrade one of your leaders. And it doesn't matter whether this leader's standee is on the map or not. If there's an upgrade cost in the bottom right corner, pay it in addition, and then flip the card over to its upgraded side. Irrespective of anything else that happens to that standee in combat, this leader remains upgraded for the rest of the game. Once all players have finished the movement phase, you'll now go to the combat phase. Any hex on the map where more than 1 faction has a presence will be a site for combat. Each combat pits 2 factions against each other and will result in one of those 2 factions being expelled from the hex. You will need to resolve combats until all hexes are owned by only 1 faction. Players choose which combat to resolve in turn order, starting from the player with the laser gun and going clockwise. On your turn, if you are engaged in any combats on the board, then you must choose one of those combats. That is, choose a hex and choose a single other faction in that hex to be the opponent. That combat gets resolved in full, and then play passes to the next player who chooses their own combat, and so on. Once you're engaged in no combats, you pass when it's your turn, and once there are no combats left on the board, the phase is over. So now let's look at how a single round of combat works. To start, each player is given an identical combat wheel. Simultaneously and secretly, players make two choices. They can rotate this wheel to whichever orientation they wish, lining up these two symbols with the numbers at the top of this printed card. Then they may cover the pre-printed tactics card with a tactics card from hand, either playing it face up for that tactic card's effect, or playing it face down. Doing this is purely to give the illusion of playing a card. When the cards are revealed, this would be returned to hand and you would use the pre-printed card. Once both players have chosen a position on their wheel and chosen a tactics card, or not, then the players simultaneously reveal. The first step when revealing cards is if any player has chosen a wedge showing this icon, -1 gem to roll the strength die, then they must do this now. A player with no gems cannot choose this wedge, and once chosen, a player cannot go back on that decision. Next, each player adds up their total strength, represented by the fist icon, and this determines who wins the combat, and therefore wins the hex. Strength comes from any strength combinations between the wheel and the tactics card, anything rolled on the dice, units, buildings, and effects on leaders and tactics cards. So here, from the wheel, Grey has 1 strength from this combination and 2 strength from the die. Each fighter adds 1 strength, so that's a total of 9. Each outpost adds 2 strength for a total of 11. And Grey has no leader or strength benefit from the tactics card, so the total is 11. Purple has 1 strength from the wheel, has no die, and gets 4 strength from these fighters, up to 5. This leader is in the battle and has 2 strength, which brings the total up to 7. And this tactics card has a combat effect to add 2 strength if you have fewer units than your opponent, which purple does, so that adds up to a total of 9. As such, Grey wins the battle 11-9, and Grey will hold on to this hex and expel the purple player. In the event of a tie, whoever chose this combat, that is, whoever is the current active player, breaks the tie. Next, you'll resolve fighter casualties, and this is entirely separate to the strength. Here, you'll use the attack and defense icons to determine how many fighters each player loses. These icons can be found on the wheel, the tactics card, on one face of the die, and on leaders. The units themselves do not contribute. So in this case, Grey has a total of 2 attack from this effect on the card, to attack if rolling a die in this battle. Purple has 1 defense, which comes from the leader, and 2 versus 1 means purple suffers 1 casualty. This fighter being removed from the board and placed into the wounded section on the player's player board. Purple has a total of 3 attack from the wheel, with none from the leader, and Grey has a total of 3 defense from the wheel, meaning no casualties are suffered. Casualties are always taken by losing fighters, not leaders, and you can lose no more than 4 casualties per battle. Next, all of the loser's remaining units in that hex are expelled. Any fighters are returned to that player's base. Leaders are removed from the map entirely and will have to be deployed again if the player wishes to bring them back into play. And any of the loser's buildings are razed. The piece is removed from the board, leaving the foundation, and returned to the rightmost open space on the player board, gaining the benefits shown underneath it as compensation. Played tactics cards are discarded. Combat introduces some other special cases. This wedge can only be chosen by a faction with at least 4 fighters and no leaders in the hex. With 2 attack icons, this one is designed for maximum casualties. A player who expects to lose can also turn the wheel to the retreat dial in order to minimize losses. You'll skip step 1 since this always counts as losing the battle, and then you'll resolve wounds in the normal way, but you'll be well protected because both of these are defensive. Then you can do a redeployment movement with all of your fighters in the hex. This lets you move them to any adjacent hex where you already have a presence, ignoring any pinning restrictions. If no such hex exists, then they go back to base like normal. Leaders in the battle then return to your base instead of being removed from the board. If you choose to play no tactics card, then you have a further penalty when retreating. You get 2 fewer shields. This essentially cancels these 2 shields, meaning you'll have a lot of casualties and then retreat with whoever is left. If both players choose to retreat, then you'll count up the strengths in the normal way for step 1, and whoever had the higher strength is the one who retreats and loses the battle. The lower strength remains and counts as the winner. Finally, if a faction wins the combat but suffers complete casualties in the process, the loser still suffers all of the penalties shown in step 3 of the combat. That is, leaders lost from the board, fighters back to base, and buildings destroyed. It just means that the winner does not remain to hold that hex. Once there are no hexes left in combat, the combat phase ends and you'll move to gain income. Each player will now count up the number of hexes they control, that is, any hex where they have any presence. This includes the player's base. The player then gains the benefit of that column as income. This icon is a single redeployment of units, which works the same way as it did on the combat wheel, with the exception that you cannot redeploy out of the region with the current round's relic. This icon lets you upgrade an attribute, which will either increase one of your powers or reduce one of your impediments. As usual, if it has a cost in the bottom right corner, you'll need to pay that cost in order to upgrade it. Then gain anything else next to an income icon, most of which are along this line of your player board. This player would gain these resources and could optionally spend 1 gem per stronghold built on a research point. Finally, you'll check relics, which we described before. If a player controls all remaining relics, they win, and if not, whoever controls this round's relic takes it from the board and gets the bonus they cover. This does come at a small cost, as all units the player has in that area are returned to base, although buildings are allowed to stay. Remember that once the relic has been taken, the foundation under it is now available for players to build on. Player pricing tokens are discarded to their vaults. The top tile of a neutral stack is removed if the depicted relic is the one that was removed this round. And you'll proceed to the next round. Some more things to know before we go into the individual factions. We've mentioned tactics cards a number of times, and you can draw them with this icon. Your maximum hand limit is 5. Most of these will have these numbers that you'll use in combat and an additional combat effect, but there's also an effect down the bottom of the card which you can use by spending the card to the discard pile in the corresponding phase. In some cases, the card's effect will have a gem lock on it. And in some cases, the card will give you a bonus if you pass out of a specific phase. You can never play a tactics card in the same phase you acquired it. You must wait till at least the next phase. The foundation tiles come with some very useful engine building effects. This one we saw before. As part of income, you can spend a gem to gain a research for each stronghold you've built. This one lets you spend 2 energy instead of a gem to get past any gem lock. This one lets you harvest from any building, not just a foundry. This one lets you treat any building as being adjacent to your base, not just an outpost. And this one increases your hand limit and gives you 2 immediate energy. Each player also has 1 troop token which you can use to reduce clutter. If a player reaches the end of their fame track, then the game ends immediately and that player wins. Alternatively, in the check relics phase, if the same player controls all remaining relics on the board, then that player wins. If the 6th round ends and no player controls relic 6, Or if two factions meet their win conditions at exactly the same time, then you'll go to the tiebreaker. Among tied players, whoever controls the most land areas wins. If still tied, whoever collected the most relics through the game, and if still tied, victory is shared. We'll now take you through the game's 6 individual factions. Most of the special rules associated with the factions are either on the player board or on the 3 attribute cards, and remember that these can be upgraded through the game. Understanding all the intricacies is key to playing these factions well. And these rules are also explained on the faction help cards, with some tips for playing as and against that faction. The Oxataya faction gains fame by winning battles, that is, by having the most strength in battles, and needs 9 fame to win. One of their key strengths is in using leaders. Oxataya can have 2 or 3 leaders in the same battle, whereas most factions can have 1. Due to the subterranean ability, the Oxataya can enter and build in lakes. And due to resourceful, can take the lower half of the action it priced for a round for free, or twice for the price of 1 when upgraded. Units can be recruited straight to an Oxataya stronghold once it's been placed on the board. AI gains fame by wounding opposing fighters in battle, and needs 18 fame to win. However, this is restricted to start the game. You can only wound up to 1 fighter for each building and unit you have in the battle. And you're still limited to the maximum of 4 wounds per battle. Once you've upgraded this attribute, the 1 wound per building or unit restriction goes away. And once you've upgraded the cunning attribute, you can also gain fame by raising buildings or defeating leaders. However, you're still limited to a maximum of 4 fame per battle. You have the easiest path to bring your own fighters back from wounds. It costs only 1 recruitment point to get them back. And you have more fighter pieces than any other player, 30 instead of the usual 20. However, 10 of them begin the game locked up on this card, and at the end of each round you have to move another one from your player board to the card. Only once you upgrade this attribute do you lose that penalty and gain access to all of those fighters. As a result of all of this, the way you manage your fighters on the board and work to get these upgraded will be quite different to the other factions. When you place a stronghold on the map, it also comes with a trap token. And if another player moves into a hex with your trap, then the trap sets off, one of its fighters is wounded, and you gain a fame. Traps reset at the end of the round, and if the stronghold is ever raised, the trap is removed as well. The Zcharo faction is all about research. You gain 1 fame per research, and you need 20 fame to win, meaning you have to max out all 5 research tracks. You can gain research in the normal way, you can gain it by gaining relics, and you can gain research when you raise opponents' buildings after winning battles. The proficient ability can be used once per round to act as if the research track is 1 step higher than it is when taking an action. And seclusive can be used to deprive other players of money that they've priced in the pricing phase, by paying the whole cost of the supply instead of paying a portion to the player. Zcharo has 4 outposts and 2 strongholds instead of 3 and 3, can have 2 outposts per region, and all of these buildings add strength, making them quite good in static combat. Finally, unlike every other faction who wins immediately upon reaching the end of the fame track, Zcharo must wait until the end of the next relics phase to win the game. But upon reaching 20 fame, this comes off the board, and Zcharo gets this bonus for the rest of that round, to try to help them retain the victory. Leyrien gains fame primarily by placing morale tokens on the main board and then holding them there through the income phase. Leyrien needs 14 fame to win. Morale may be gained and lost as the game goes on, and there can only be 1 morale on the board per hex, but at any point these 2 rows cannot be more than 1 morale apart from each other. That is, the next morale taken could not be this one, it would have to be this one. Morale is placed in 3 ways. The first time Leyrien controls a relic, 1 morale is placed on the Leyrien base, and this is never lost. Through the Spirited attribute, Leyrien always places morale on any swamp area it controls. And if Spirited is upgraded, this extends to all swamps that are not controlled by any other player. But any swamp morale comes off the board if another player controls that hex. Thirdly, when you place a stronghold in a region, you also place a morale with it, and you can't build these in swamps. If you lose the stronghold, you also lose the morale. Each bottom half morale that you have on the board gives you 1 fame in each gain income phase. Each top half morale that you have on the board grants you 1 strength in a battle in any area where you have morale. And if you upgrade your optimistic attribute, then you also upgrade all your morale tokens, giving you +2 attack in regions which have your morale. You truly are the faction of the swamp, and treat all swamp hexes as if they're adjacent. Jrayek gains 1 fame for each opposing leader present in a battle when Jrayek wins the battle. Jrayek needs 5 fame to win. Of course, opponents could try to stymie the Jrayek player by refusing to deploy their leaders, and to counteract that, Jrayek has access to its own set of neutral mercenary leaders called the Raizu, and these can be introduced to the game on the other player's behalf. How this works is explained on the Assertive card. When Jrayek plays a pricing token which shows one of the Raizu, then that Raizu has to come into play. This can be done by deploying that Raizu into a land area where Jrayek already has presence. This is called deploying. Alternatively, the Raizu can be given to another player and placed in a land territory where they have presence, or into their base if they have no presence in any territories. This is called tribute. Either way, the Raizu belongs to the player who controls the hex it's in. It does not count as a leader, meaning that a player can have its leader and a Raizu in the same area. However, you count its combat attributes in favour of the player who controls it in the same way that you would a leader. If a faction controlling a Raizu loses a battle, then after all the usual retreats and wounds, then the Raizu remains in that territory and is now controlled by the winner. For any opposing leader or opposing controlled Raizu in a battle which Jrayek wins, Jrayek gains 1 fame, up to a maximum of 2 per battle. For any Raizu present on the board, the matching token is placed on one of these 3 income spaces, on the black side if Jrayek does not control it, or on the red side if Jrayek does. This should be flipped over if the Raizu changes hands. Jrayek gains an income benefit for every opposing controlled Raizu on the board during the gain income phase, but has to pay a price for every one of its own controlled Raizu. If the player cannot afford the cost, then the Raizu must be taken off the board. Otherwise, Jrayek's abilities are mostly helpful in combat. Jrayek gains energy for wounding fighters, and with this upgrade, can control 2 Raizu, as well as their leader, in a combat. Most players can only control 1. Jrayek's strongholds grant attack and defense, and Jrayek is stronger on cliffs. Finally, we have Circadians. Circadians gain fame from upgrading their attribute cards. They have 4 of these, unlike the 3 that all other players have, and they need all 4 of that fame to win. Normally, the only way you can do this is by controlling 6 or more hexes in the gain income phase, but Circadians can also gain access to this through their relic bonuses. The Circadians have only 10 total fighters compared with the usual 20, and require an extra recruitment point to get each on the board. But it's worth it, these fighters are much stronger, each having 2 strength and capable of pinning 2 opposing units. The fighters get even stronger when upgraded. However, the low unit count still makes it difficult to control 6 regions, and so there are a couple of other abilities at your disposal. You can only place 1 stronghold in each terrain type. But while there's a stronghold on the board, it counts as its own additional region when doing gain income. Secondly, the first time you defeat another player in combat, you get that faction's intel card into your supply. Once per game, you can flip this over and give it to that faction, essentially giving them intel on yourself to count an extra region for this income phase. However, from this point forward, that faction has an advantage against you in combat. Circadian's other major difference is the absence of a base. Instead, during setup, you choose where you would put your base, but instead place your dropship on the border between the two adjacent land hexes. You would complete the rest of the setup regarding controlling those hexes in the usual way. In the recruit phase, any unit you successfully recruit goes onto your dropship. In the movement phase, you can spend a movement point to move an adjacent group of units onto your dropship. You can spend a movement point to move your dropship to any other edge on one of the two hexes you're adjacent to. This can include onto an edge containing a mountain, although you can't end your turn there and you can't drop off units there. You have to spend another movement point to continue moving. For one movement point, you can drop any number of units off from your dropship onto one of its two adjacent hexes. And as a free action at the end of your movement action, any units still on the dropship are dropped off in one or both adjacent hexes. The dropship doesn't control either of its adjacent hexes, but it does allow you to harvest one of the adjacent hexes. And with its tactical attribute, the dropship can lend a strength and defensive support to an adjacent combat. And that's how to play Circadian's Chaos Order. We hope you enjoyed this video.
If you find this video useful, please help us by hitting that like button, subscribe to us. You can also hit the meeple in the corner to do so and hit the bell icon so you'll know when we have new videos. You can also follow me on Instagram for my board games journey.
Comments, suggestions and feedback are all welcome in the comment section below.
Thanks for watching and see you next time!